Ancient Greece, celebrated for its intellectual and artistic achievements, also harbored a deeply ingrained patriarchy that severely limited the lives of women. While Athens, one of the most influential Greek city-states, became the birthplace of democracy, its democratic ideals were far from inclusive. Women, the very half of the population that helped sustain Greek civilization, had their rights and autonomy curtailed by societal and religious norms. Their lives, largely confined to the domestic realm, were shaped by the ideologies of male philosophers, statesmen, and lawmakers who believed women were best suited for roles within the oikos, the home, where they maintained the moral order of the household. The oikos was not just a living space. It was the center of Greek family life, and within it, the woman's role was essential but undervalued. A woman's status in society was often determined by her ability to marry well, bear children, and manage her household efficiently. Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle viewed women as imperfect versions of men, not capable of achieving intellectual or moral equality. To them, women were governed by emotions rather than reason, making them unsuited for public or intellectual life. In Athens, the world of men and women rarely intersected. Men engaged in politics, philosophy, and public life, while women were confined to their homes, relegated to the private sphere. The Athenian ideal of a virtuous woman was one who was modest, quiet, and obedient. Someone who embodied the idous modesty and self-restraint necessary for maintaining the integrity of her family and community. These ideals shaped every aspect of a woman's existence. From the moment a girl was born, her life was directed toward becoming a respectable wife and mother. In Athens, girls were not formally educated in the same way boys were. The typical education for girls centered on domestic skills, how to spin, weave, cook, and manage the home. Boys, on the other hand, were sent to schools where they learned to read, write, and engage in public debates. This lack of formal education for women was not seen as a form of oppression by Greek society, but rather as a natural division of labor, one that reflected the gender roles that had been codified over generations. Women were not expected to be philosophers, politicians, or scholars. Their role was to support the intellectual pursuits of men by creating a stable home life. Despite these constraints, women in ancient Greece still held a significant role in shaping their family's destiny. A woman's ability to manage the household could determine the family's financial success, as the production of textiles was one of the most valuable commodities of the time. In this way, women contributed to the economy, even though their labor was largely invisible to society. Women worked tirelessly to weave cloth, prepare meals, and ensure that the family had enough to survive. They were responsible for the management of slaves, servants, and other workers in the home, coordinating daily activities to ensure everything ran smoothly. Marriage in ancient Greece was primarily viewed as a social contract. A woman's value was often measured by her ability to produce children, especially male heirs who would carry on the family name and inherit wealth. For this reason, girls were married young, typically between 12 and 14 years old, and too much. Older men, often 20 to 30 years their senior. A woman's consent was rarely sought for these marriages. They were arranged by the father or male guardian, who sought to secure the family's status, wealth, and influence. For many women, marriage was the beginning of a new phase of subjugation. Once married, a woman was expected to focus entirely on her duties within the home and was not allowed to engage in public activities. In contrast to the domestic confines of Athenian women, The women of Sparta experienced greater freedoms and responsibilities. Sparta was a militaristic society that valued strength, discipline, and courage. Spartan women were expected to be physically fit and healthy, as their primary role was to bear strong sons who would grow up to be warriors. Spartan women were trained in physical exercise, had access to education, and could own property, which was a rare privilege for women in ancient Greece. They could even participate in some aspects of public life. However, their role was still heavily tied to the state's military needs. A Spartan woman's primary responsibility was to produce strong heirs for the state and ensure the well-being of her husband's estate while he was away at war. Yet, even in Sparta, women's lives were centered around family and procreation. While they had more rights than their Athenian counterparts, their social standing was still determined by their ability to fulfill the expectations of motherhood. Spartan women were expected to bear and raise strong warriors, and this task was seen as central to the state's success. Their personal desires, though not entirely suppressed, were always secondary to their duties to Sparta's military system. Spartan women were celebrated for their strength, but their strength was always channeled into the service of the state and family. Despite the significant differences between Athens and Sparta, the overarching expectation for all women in ancient Greece was the same. Their primary role was that of a wife and mother. Women's lives were tied to the home, and their identities were defined by their relationships to the men in their lives. For Athenian women, the most important relationship was with their husbands, while for Spartan women, it was with the state. But in both cases, women's lives were constrained by societal expectations that revolved around marriage, motherhood, and household management. Despite these constraints, there were occasional glimpses of women who broke from the traditional mold. Sappho, the poet from Lesbos, is one such figure. Known for her lyrical poetry, Sappho expressed deep emotions and complex feelings about love, relationships, and identity. Her work, much of which has been lost to history, provided a rare and powerful voice for women in an era when women's voices were not widely heard. Sappho's love poems, many of which were addressed to other women, offered an alternative narrative to the male-dominated traditions of ancient Greece, one that acknowledged women's emotional depth and desires. Her influence reached far beyond her own time, shaping the poetic traditions of the Western world and giving women a platform to express their experiences. Similarly, Aspasia, the companion of the Athenian statesman Pericles, became a prominent intellectual figure in Athens. Though her position as a woman in a male-dominated society was unconventional, she was known for her intelligence, charm, and eloquence. Aspasia was credited with influencing some of Athens' greatest minds, including Pericles himself. She hosted a salon where intellectuals, philosophers, and politicians gathered to discuss ideas. A rare opportunity for women in a society that generally restricted their public engagement. Though she was not officially recognized as a political figure, Aspasia's intellectual influence was undeniable, and her life serves as a testament to the potential for women to wield power and influence, even in a society that systematically excluded them from political participation. Women like Sappho and Aspasia were exceptions rather than the rule, and their stories stand in stark contrast to the lives of most women in ancient Greece. The majority of Greek women lived in the shadow of their male relatives, their lives defined by their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers. Their contributions to society, though vital, were rarely acknowledged in the historical record. The Work of women in the home was seen as a private matter, not as a public achievement. Their voices, their desires, and their struggles were often silenced in favor of the more celebrated contributions of men. Yet, even in the face of these constraints, women in ancient Greece found ways to exert influence, whether through their roles in the household, their participation in religious rituals, or their occasional foray into intellectual life. Women played an essential part in the functioning of Greek society. Their struggles, though hidden, were as crucial to the survival of Greek civilization as the achievements of the men who are often celebrated in history. In ancient Greece, the institution of marriage was the bedrock of society. For women, it was not just a personal or romantic choice, but a social and economic necessity. A woman's identity and value were often determined by her ability to marry and bear children, especially male heirs who would carry on the family name and fortune. Marriage was regarded as both a private and public affair, essential for the continuation of the family line, the preservation of wealth, and the stability of the city-state itself. However, marriage in ancient Greece was not a relationship based on love or mutual affection, but rather a strategic alliance between two families, designed to secure political, social, and economic power. For Athenian women, marriage was a process governed by their male guardians. At birth, a girl's life was controlled by her father, and once married, she became the property of her husband. Fathers typically arranged marriages for their daughters, often when the girls were as young as 12 or 13, while the groom was usually much older, sometimes 20 years her senior. The purpose of marriage was not to unite two people for personal happiness, but to create an heir and ensure the continuation of the family name. Romantic love, while present in literature and poetry, had little place in the realities of marriage. For most women, when an Athenian girl was married, she was expected to become a part of her husband's household, the oikos. The husband was considered the head of the household, while the wife's role was to manage domestic affairs. This included supervising slaves and servants, preparing food, weaving clothes, and raising children. In essence, a woman's role was to support her husband's position by maintaining the household and raising children who would ensure the continuation of his family line. A woman's reputation, and by extension her family's, was determined by how well she fulfilled these duties. The concept of kalos or beauty was important in Athenian society. But for women, it was not just about physical attractiveness. A woman's beauty was tied to her virtue, her chastity, modesty, and ability to maintain the moral integrity of the family. The ideal Athenian wife was one who was virtuous, unobtrusive, and focused solely on her domestic duties. A woman who strayed from this ideal, whether by engaging in extramarital affairs or by failing to properly manage her household, could bring dishonor to her family. Women's marriages were often a time of emotional and psychological isolation. A married woman was expected to remain at home, rarely leaving her house except for religious festivals, and even then, she had to adhere to strict codes of modesty and propriety. The idea of a woman going out into the public space of the agora or attending political meetings was practically unthinkable. Women were expected to keep their private lives separate from the public sphere, making their world largely confined to the domestic space. However, there were moments when a woman's role within the family could transcend these limitations. Childbirth was one of the few areas in which women could exercise control over their lives. The birth of a son, especially, was seen as a momentous event for the family, ensuring its future prosperity and continuing the family name. It was believed that a woman's role in childbirth was a direct contribution to the health of the state. However, childbirth was also a dangerous affair, fraught with the risk of maternal mortality. Without modern medical knowledge, many women died in childbirth, and the death of a mother during labor was seen as a tragic but common part of life. While Athenian women's lives were governed by strict codes of behavior, their counterparts in Sparta experienced a somewhat different reality. Spartan women were given a greater degree of freedom and autonomy, particularly in terms of managing property and engaging in public life. In Sparta, women were trained to be physically strong, as their primary role was to produce strong soldiers. For the state, unlike their Athenian counterparts, Spartan women could own land, manage estates, and engage in some public activities. They were still expected to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers, but they were not confined to the domestic sphere in the same way. Marriage in Sparta, though still an institution aimed at producing strong offspring, allowed women more freedom and independence. Women were encouraged to participate in physical training, and some were even allowed to own property. The freedom afforded to Spartan women stemmed from the militaristic and communal nature of Spartan society, which relied on a strong and healthy citizenry. Spartan women were expected to give birth to strong, healthy children, but they were also expected to be strong themselves, ensuring that they could contribute to the state in ways that went beyond traditional domestic roles. For Athenian women, however, their primary role as wives and mothers defined their lives. The majority of their time was spent maintaining the household, cooking, cleaning, and weaving the cloth that would clothe their families. The art of weaving was particularly important in ancient Greek society, and women's weaving skills were considered essential to the smooth functioning of the household. Weaving was often seen as an expression of a woman's virtue and diligence. As such, it was an art that was passed down from mother to daughter, becoming a central part of a woman's education. Beyond household duties, a woman's life was also filled with rituals, many of which revolved around religion. Women played an important role in religious ceremonies and festivals, although their involvement was generally confined to certain spaces and events. In Athens, for example, women could participate in the Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, which celebrated the fertility of the land and the women who helped to sustain it. These festivals provided women with a rare opportunity to engage in public life and to exert some degree of influence. But even here, they were largely confined to the female-only spaces of the festival. Women did not hold positions of power in religious institutions, and most of their religious practices were focused on the domestic realm, performing rituals to honor the gods and ensure the prosperity of their family. The birth of a child, particularly a male child, was a key moment in a woman's life. Bearing children was seen as a woman's duty to both her husband and society. A son was seen as the continuation of the family line, and his birth was celebrated as a success for both the mother and father. A daughter, however, was often seen as less significant. She would eventually marry and leave the family, carrying her dowry to her new home. In many cases, a woman's value was tied to her ability to bear sons who would carry on the family name and inherit wealth. This gendered perspective on children reinforced the idea that a woman's worth was linked to her reproductive capabilities, rather than her personal attributes or achievements. Women's relationships with their husbands were also shaped by the structure of marriage. In ancient Greece, marriage was often a contractual arrangement rather than a romantic union. A woman's role in marriage was to be obedient to her husband, raise children, and manage the household. While there were certainly exceptions, such As the relationships of Aspasia and Sappho, the majority of women's marriages were not centered on love or affection, but rather on family alliances, wealth, and securing heirs. In ancient Greece, the education of women was significantly different from that of men, and it was shaped by the patriarchal norms of the time. While men were expected to engage with philosophy, politics, and the arts, women were largely excluded from these pursuits, their education being limited to domestic skills that would prepare them for their roles as wives and mothers. This disparity in education reflects the broader societal structure, where women were relegated to the private sphere of the household and excluded from the intellectual and political spheres that were the domain of men. The educational system for girls in ancient Greece was informal and centered primarily around domestic training. Girls were taught by their mothers or female relatives, learning the skills necessary to manage a household. They were taught how to spin and weave, how to prepare food, and how to care for children. These were seen as the essential roles for women, and their education was designed to prepare them for these duties. However, this form of education was not seen as valuable in the same way that the education of boys was. Boys were sent to formal schools where they were taught subjects like reading, writing, mathematics, and rhetoric skills deemed essential for participation in public life. In Athens, the situation was particularly restrictive. Girls were not sent to school, and their education was confined to the domestic realm. Athenian girls were expected to marry young and were often married off at the age of 12 or 13, their primary function being to run the household and raise children. The few opportunities for women to gain formal education were often limited to the wealthy elite, where women could be tutored privately in subjects like music and philosophy, but these instances were rare. In contrast, Athenian men were given a comprehensive education, often attending schools where they were taught by prominent philosophers and intellectuals. This educational divide ensured that women remained excluded from the intellectual and political life of the city. Yet, despite these restrictions, there were some women in ancient Greece who defied the norms and became intellectual figures. One of the most well-known examples is Sappho, the poet from Lesbos. Although much of her work has been lost, the fragments that remain suggest that she was a highly educated woman with a deep understanding of both love and the human experience. Her poetry, celebrated for its emotional depth and lyrical beauty, stands in stark contrast to the limited education available to most women of her time. Sappho's poetry also challenges the notion that women were incapable of intellectual pursuits, as her work offers a nuanced exploration of relationships, emotions, and identity. She is considered one of the greatest poets of ancient Greece, and her influence extends far beyond her own time, providing a unique voice in the male-dominated world of literature. Another remarkable figure was Aspasia, the companion of the Athenian statesman Pericles. Aspasia was known for her intellectual prowess, and it is said that she was highly educated, engaging in intellectual discussions with some of the most influential figures of the time, including Socrates and Pericles. Aspasia is often credited with influencing the development of rhetoric in Athens, and she was well known for her ability to articulate complex ideas. Though she was not given formal status as a public intellectual, Aspasia's ability to navigate the male-dominated world of Athenian politics and philosophy showcases the potential for women to be intellectual forces, even in a society that restricted their formal education. In contrast to the limited educational opportunities available to most women, religious life in ancient Greece offered women more opportunities for public involvement. Religion played a central role in Greek society, and women had a significant presence in religious rituals and ceremonies. In many city-states, women were actively involved in religious life, serving as priestesses, participating in sacred festivals, and making offerings to the gods. Although they were not allowed to hold positions of political power, women could exert some degree of influence in religious and cultural spheres. One of the most important roles women could hold in ancient Greece was that of the priestess. Priestesses were women who served in temples and performed rituals to honor the gods. They were respected members of society, and their roles were crucial for the maintenance of religious and social order. Priestesses could hold a significant amount of power within their communities, and their role in religious ceremonies was essential to the functioning of the Greek city-states. The priestess of Athena, for example, played a vital role in maintaining the spiritual health of Athens, and her position was considered one of high prestige. Women also participated in various religious festivals, which were among the few occasions where they could engage in public life. One of the most famous festivals in which women played a prominent role was the Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, the goddesses of fertility and agriculture. The Thesmophoria was a women-only festival that celebrated the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, and it was centered around the fertility of the land and the role of women in ensuring its prosperity. During this festival, women gathered in private spaces to offer sacrifices and perform rituals that would ensure the fertility of the crops and the health of their families. The festival was an important expression of women's religious and cultural power, even though their public involvement was otherwise limited. The role of women in religious life was not just confined to rituals and ceremonies. Women also played an important part in maintaining the moral fabric of society through their religious practices. Women were responsible for upholding the spiritual health of the household, and their role in domestic rituals was considered essential. For the stability of the family, they would perform daily offerings, make prayers for their family's well-being, and conduct religious ceremonies to honor the gods. In many ways, religious life gave women a space in which they could exert influence and engage with the broader community, even though their roles were still confined to the private sphere. While women in ancient Greece were often excluded from formal education and political power, their influence was still felt in significant ways. They were the bearers of culture, the preservers of family traditions, and the keepers of spiritual order. Though their voices were rarely heard in the public debates of philosophers and politicians, women played a crucial role in the day-to-day functioning of society through both their domestic duties and their participation in religious life. Furthermore, women's intellectual contributions were not entirely absent from ancient Greek society. While the majority of women's education focused on domestic tasks, some women did have the opportunity to engage with intellectual life, especially in places like the intellectual salons of wealthy families. These spaces allowed women to engage in philosophical discussions, study rhetoric, and even influence the political ideas of their time. However, these women were often exceptions rather than the rule. Most women, regardless of their intellect or potential, were restricted by the societal norms that kept them within the confines of the Oika. As much as ancient Greece was defined by its intellectual and artistic achievements, it was also a society deeply entrenched in inequality. The marginalization of women from the world of public discourse and their confinement to the domestic sphere meant that their contributions were often overlooked, even though they were central to the functioning of Greek society. Women in ancient Greece whether through their intellectual pursuits, religious roles, or domestic responsibilities, played an essential part in sustaining the culture and the society they lived in. Their struggles, often hidden from view, were as much a part of the story of ancient Greece as the achievements of the men who shaped its political and intellectual legacy. Women in ancient Greece faced a unique set of challenges, both within their domestic roles and as members of a society that was largely governed by male ideals. While much of their time was spent fulfilling domestic duties and raising children, their health and legal rights were areas where their lives were deeply restricted. Women's health, especially when it came to childbirth, was a major concern, as it not only determined their own survival, but also the survival of the family line. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could undergo, and without modern medical knowledge, complications were common. In some cases, the birth of a child could mean the death of the mother, a reality that was tragically common in ancient Greece. The threat of maternal mortality was ever present, and many women faced difficult pregnancies, complicated births, or prolonged labors with little help. The lack of medical understanding and technology meant that women relied on midwives for assistance during childbirth. Midwives, often older women who had experience with childbirth, were seen as an essential part of a woman's life, guiding her through the process and ensuring, to the best of their ability, that the woman survived the ordeal. However, despite the important role midwives played, their knowledge was still limited, and many women suffered or died in childbirth due to complications such as hemorrhaging, infections, or breech births. In an age where hygiene practices were rudimentary at best, women often faced severe health risks, and the lack of effective treatment for postpartum complications only exacerbated the danger. After childbirth, women's health continued to be neglected in many ways. The responsibility of raising children fell largely on women's shoulders, and they were expected to nurse, care for, and raise their children while still maintaining the domestic sphere. There was little recognition of the toll this took on women's bodies or their mental well-being. Women's physical needs were often secondary to their roles as wives and mothers. They had to carry the burden of ensuring that the family survived, while managing the demands of the household. For many women, this meant living in a constant state of exhaustion, with limited opportunities for rest or personal time. The lack of legal rights for women in ancient Greece was another significant issue that shaped their lives. Greek women were considered the legal property of their male guardians, first their fathers and then their husbands. A woman's legal status was tied to the male members of her family, and she had little to no autonomy in the eyes of the law. In Athens, women could not own property independently, and any wealth or land they inherited was controlled by their father or husband. They had no right to vote or participate in public life, and their legal identities were subsumed under the full authority of the men in their lives. Marriage was often the primary way in which women were linked to the legal and economic structures of Greek society. In Athens, the legal contract of marriage was an arrangement between two families, and the woman's role within this contract was not one of equality, but of obligation. Upon marriage, a woman's father would transfer control of her life and property to her husband, who became her legal guardian. This meant that a woman had no rights to make decisions about her own property or finances. Everything was subject to the authority of her husband. Women were also not allowed to represent themselves in court or participate in legal proceedings unless under the guardianship of a man. In this sense, a woman's status was entirely dependent on her relationship with her male guardian. Despite these legal restrictions, Some women were able to exert influence within the confines of their domestic roles. Women were crucial to the economic success of their families, especially in the agricultural and textile industries. They worked tirelessly to produce textiles, including clothing, blankets, and other fabric-based goods that were sold or used within the family. The production of textiles was essential to Greek society, and women's work in this area was vital to the functioning of the household economy. Although their work was rarely acknowledged by society at large, the labor women contributed in the form of domestic production was one of the key factors that allowed Greek society to thrive. In Sparta, the situation was somewhat different. While women in Athens were restricted to the private sphere, Spartan women were granted more autonomy and legal rights. Spartan women were expected to be physically strong and healthy, as their primary role was to bear children who could become warriors for the state. Spartan women were allowed to own property, engage in physical training, and participate in certain public activities. This relative freedom was a result of Sparta's militaristic society, where strong, healthy citizens were essential for the survival of the state. Women's ability to own land and manage their estates was seen as a practical necessity, as it allowed Spartan men to focus on military training and warfare. However, even in Sparta, women's rights were still limited by the expectations placed upon them as mothers. Their primary role was to produce strong sons who would grow up to fight in the Spartan army. While Spartan women were more liberated than their Athenian counterparts, their freedom was always tied to the state's need for military strength. The power of Spartan women was not a reflection of individual autonomy or self-determination, but rather an expression of the collective needs of the state. In this sense, Spartan women were free, but only insofar as their role in society served the military needs of the state. The lack of legal rights for women in ancient Greece was a pervasive problem, and it often had lasting effects on women's ability to navigate society. While women could exert influence through their roles as wives and mothers, their power was always mediated by the men around them. Women had little control over their own lives, their finances, or their property, and their legal status was always tied to the men who were their guardians. This legal subjugation of women was rooted in the belief that women were inherently inferior to men and incapable of participating in the public and intellectual life of the city. Despite these restrictions, the legacy of Greek women's influence can be seen in the way they shaped the household, the economy, and religious practices. While their power may have been invisible, it was nonetheless real. Women's labor in the domestic sphere provided the foundation for the stability of Greek society, and their roles in religious rituals gave them a voice in the spiritual life of the city. In this way, Greek women were able to carve out a space for themselves, even within the limitations imposed by their society. While the legal and social structures of ancient Greece confined women to the domestic sphere, the subtle impact of their actions and contributions to society was undeniable. Women's work in the home, their participation in religious rituals, and their roles as mothers and wives were essential to the functioning of Greek society. Though their lives were often hidden from the public eye, their influence in the private sphere shaped the culture, the economy, and the social order of ancient Greece.